Yes, Pa. They sure are pretty.
Should have seen her on the way home. It's like she was looking at the world for the first time.
Oh, I'm so happy for her.
For decades, Karen Grassle was America's favorite mother. As Ma on Little House on the Prairie, she brought warmth, strength, and grace into millions of homes. But behind the camera, something darker was unfolding. She never said a word, not when it was happening, not when the show ended, not even when the spotlight faded. Until now. At 82 years old, Karen is finally telling the truth about what Michael Landon did to her. And once you hear her story, you'll never see that beloved show or that man the same way again. The perfect set that wasn't. When Little House on the Prairie first aired in 1974, it didn't take long for America to fall in love with its wholesome charm. At the center of the show stood Karen Grassle as Caroline Ingalls. Soft-spoken, nurturing, and endlessly patient. She was everything fans wanted in a frontier mother.
To be like Mary's. She's older than you are. She knows more words.
I know lots of words, Ma.
But behind the gentle exterior of that role, Karen was quietly wrestling with a reality that didn't match the public image. To millions, Michael Landon and Karen Grassle were the perfect on-screen couple. But behind the scenes, Landon held all the power, and it showed. From the start, Landon didn't just play the lead role. He created the show. He wrote the scripts. He directed episodes. He controlled the tone, the casting, the dialogue, even the camera angles. And Karen Grassle, though a classically trained actress with experience in Shakespeare and Broadway, had to adjust to that kind of centralized control. She joined the cast expecting a collaborative environment. What she got instead was a workplace ruled by one man's ego and vision. At first, it wasn't unbearable. Landon was charming, funny, and known for his long hours and fierce dedication to the show's success. But Grassle noticed how that same dedication came with dominance. Nothing happened without his approval. And as the show gained popularity, his control grew even more absolute. By season 2, the cracks began to show. Karen noticed that her input on scenes, dialogue, character development was rarely taken seriously. Suggestions were brushed off. At script readings, her scenes were sometimes rewritten or trimmed without discussion. And yet, she stayed professional. Like many actresses in 1970s Hollywood, she knew that silence was often the price of survival. The first major turning point came when she asked for a raise. The show was a ratings hit. Viewers adored her character. Merchandise was flying off shelves. But Karen was still being paid far less than she believed was fair, especially compared to her male counterparts. So she did what any professional would do. She approached Landon and asked for her contract to be renegotiated. His response wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was something worse: quiet retaliation. Scenes that had once been written to showcase Caroline Ingalls' strength were reworked to focus more on Charles. Dialogues that had once allowed her to anchor the emotional tone of the show were pared down. In moments that once highlighted a marriage of equals, Landon began making sure his character took center stage. The imbalance wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. Karen began to realize this was about control. Landon wasn't just denying her a raise. He was reminding her who held the reins, and he did it the way he knew best, through the scripts. In one season, her character's role in a pivotal episode was cut nearly in half, with no explanation. The new lines were given to Landon's character. When she asked about the changes, she was met with dismissive shrugs and an uncomfortable silence. And yet, she didn't quit. Karen Grassle understood the stakes. She knew how hard it was for a woman over 30 to land a leading role in primetime television. She knew the power Landon held in the industry. And she knew that if she made waves, she might never work again. So she kept showing up. She delivered her lines. She smiled in interviews. She played the part of the grateful co-star while quietly enduring what felt like emotional erosion behind the scenes. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Landon's jokes, once playful and inclusive, started to feel different. He'd make crude remarks on set, sometimes during intimate scenes. Karen would try to laugh them off, but the sting lingered. These weren't just offhand comments. They were subtle reminders that he could push boundaries without consequence, that no one would step in to defend her, that the rules were different for him. During one particular scene, Karen had to share a close, emotional moment with Landon. As the cameras rolled and the crew stood by, Landon made a joke loud enough for everyone to hear. The room erupted in laughter. Karen didn't. She swallowed her reaction, kept her expression steady, and finished the take. That was the moment she realized she wasn't just being sidelined, she was being humiliated. She told no one. In her memoir, she would later write that the hardest part wasn't the jokes or the pay disparity. It was the isolation. There were no HR departments to turn to, no support networks for actresses quietly being pushed aside. Speaking up would have meant not just risking her job, but being labeled difficult, a career-ending tag for any woman in that era. And so she stayed. She stayed for the role, for the fans, for the work she still loved. But with every passing season, she began to feel a little less seen, a little more invisible. The public saw a perfect family. She lived something far different. But what she didn't know then was that decades later, her silence would finally break. And when it did, the truth would stun even the most loyal Little House fans. The burden of staying quiet. Karen Grassle was never one to cause a scene. That's part of what made her so good at playing Caroline Ingalls. Quiet dignity, calm resilience, unwavering grace. But behind that calm, Karen was carrying something heavier than anyone on set could see. After the tension with Michael Landon grew, she chose silence. Not because she lacked courage, but because she understood the brutal math of the entertainment industry. You speak out, you lose the job. You push back, you disappear. And Karen had worked too hard for this role to watch it vanish overnight. So she adapted. She began measuring her words more carefully in meetings. She stopped making suggestions unless asked. She stopped pushing for screen time, because every time she did, she noticed the chill from Landon become a little colder. Her confidence, once rooted in years of classical training, began to shrink, and she felt it not just in her scenes, but in her spirit. Behind the scenes, the cracks widened. Landon's on-set behavior grew bolder. He flirted with younger women in front of the crew, sometimes even in front of his own children. Karen watched in disbelief, but she kept quiet. Everyone did, because he was the boss, and the unspoken rule was clear: don't challenge him. One wrong word could cost you everything. It was during season 5 that Karen reached her breaking point. She had just come off a particularly emotional scene when Landon, instead of offering notes or encouragement, made another off-color joke, this time about her appearance. The crew laughed again, but Karen didn't just feel humiliated. She felt alone. That night, she went home and cried, not because she was weak, but because she felt trapped. She couldn't talk to producers. She couldn't talk to her co-stars. Everyone had something to lose, and no one wanted to be the first to step out of line. So Karen did what she had always done. She held it in, put on her costume the next morning, and went back to work. This cycle of suppression took its toll. Karen began to dread going to set. The job that had once brought her joy now felt like a performance within a performance. Every smile, every line, every hug she gave as Ma Ingalls became more difficult to fake. And yet, she kept going. Because at that time, she still believed it was worth it. She still believed the show was doing something good. But beneath that belief, something was shifting. For the first time, Karen started keeping notes. Nothing formal, nothing that could be used in court, just small personal records. Remarks that cut too deep. Scenes she felt were rewritten to minimize her. Changes in tone, in attitude, in treatment. She wasn't preparing for war. She was simply trying to survive. As the seasons wore on, Karen's role diminished. She was still the mother figure, still in the credits, still in the hearts of viewers. But her screen time shrank, and her emotional moments became fewer and farther between. Her character stopped evolving. She became more of a backdrop than a central figure. Off-screen, Landon's control remained unshaken. He directed more episodes. He controlled the editing process. He even reportedly handpicked which cast interviews aired and which didn't. Karen watched herself slowly vanish, not just from the scripts, but from the culture of the show. It was clear she had been made an example of, and yet no one dared to talk about it. Not the press, not the fans, not the cast. It wasn't until decades later, when Karen turned to writing her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, that she finally began to unpack it all. At first, she told herself she would focus on her childhood.
That my dad, whom I adored, we were all crazy about him, but he could turn.
Her theater days, her training. She didn't want the book to be about Little House. But the deeper she wrote, the more the memories pulled at her. The ache of silence, the sting of Landon's dismissal, the feeling of being erased. She realized then that the story needed to be told, not just for herself, but for every woman who had been pushed aside, silenced, and forgotten by the very systems they helped build. And just when she thought she was ready to share everything, an unexpected memory came flooding back. One final moment with Michael Landon that changed everything. What was in the letter she sent him, and why did it bring him to tears just before he died?
But I was happy to see that the audience enjoyed the show, and we're hopefully going to make some episodes in the future that they're going to like.
The answer might be the most surprising twist of all. The letter that changed everything. By the late 1980s, Little House on the Prairie had long since wrapped. The frontier sets were dismantled, the costumes packed away, and most of the cast had moved on to new projects or quiet retirements. Karen Grassle tried to do the same.
And it just completely broke me up. I mean, I was just laughing and crying, and that's when I knew we were going to play together.
She returned to theater, took a few television roles, but nothing ever matched the visibility she'd had as Ma Ingalls. The world still remembered her, still stopped her on the street, still called her Ma. But behind the warm smiles and public nostalgia, Karen carried the weight of a story never told. And then one day, the news came. Michael Landon was sick, not just ill, but terminal. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and the prognosis was bleak. It sent a shock through Hollywood, through fans, and yes, even through Karen. She didn't expect the grief to hit her so hard. After everything, after the hurt, the silences, the humiliations, why did she feel like crying? Why did it feel like someone had reached into her past and ripped open a wound she thought had long since scarred over? Because no matter what he did to her, Michael Landon had been a part of her life. A big part. For nearly a decade, they had worked side by side. They had cried together in emotional scenes, laughed between takes, shared meals on long production days, and carried the hopes of millions of viewers on their shoulders. Their on-screen marriage might have been scripted, but the bond it created was very real. Karen sat with that grief for weeks. She didn't reach out immediately. She didn't know how. What do you say to a man who once made you feel invisible, and yet whose hand helped write the most defining role of your career? Eventually, she did what writers do. She picked up a pen. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It was, in many ways, the opposite of what people might have expected. Karen didn't scold him. She didn't list grievances. She simply spoke the truth. She thanked him for the opportunity, for the platform, for the role that had changed her life. And she told him something even more powerful. She forgave him. Forgiveness is a word that gets thrown around too easily. But in this case, it wasn't cheap. It came at the end of decades of hurt, silence, and endurance. And Karen didn't offer it lightly. She offered it because she needed peace. Not his approval, not his apology, just her own quiet closure. The letter was mailed. She never expected a reply. But then, weeks later, word came back, not from Landon himself, but from someone close to him. He had read the letter, and he cried. It was one of the last letters Michael Landon ever received before his passing.
Actor Michael Landon is dead after a battle with inoperable liver and pancreatic cancer.
And for Karen, that was enough. She didn't need a grand reconciliation or public acknowledgement. That small moment of humanity was everything. She had spoken her truth. She had sent it out into the world, and he had received it. For the first time in years, Karen felt light. She carried that letter privately for decades. She never used it as ammunition. She never mentioned it in interviews. Even when fans brought up Landon with admiration, she kept her smile intact. It wasn't until she began writing her memoir in earnest that she finally shared that moment. And when she did, it changed everything again. Because suddenly, people saw her not just as the graceful actress they had grown up watching, but as a woman who had lived through something quietly brutal and found a way to heal without destroying anyone in the process. The letter became a symbol, not of weakness, but of extraordinary strength, of what it means to speak softly in a world that rewards shouting, of what it means to offer grace in a business that rarely returns it. And yet, even after the memoir, even after the letter became public, there was still one more surprise. Karen Grassle had spent a lifetime carrying her story alone. But after her book hit shelves, something shifted. Other voices began to rise. Former cast members, crew, even fans, because her truth gave others permission to share their own. And what they revealed next would finally shatter the myth of perfection that had surrounded Little House on the Prairie for decades. Was Michael Landon really the only one? Or was the entire show built on a foundation of silence and overlooked pain? What came out next would leave fans stunned, and Karen no longer alone in her truth. The cracks beneath the prairie.
Karen Grassle is known to so many for her warm and confident portrayal of Carolyn Ingalls on the television series Little House on the Prairie.
When Karen Grassle's memoir hit bookstores, it didn't explode with fanfare. There were no breaking headlines, no social media scandals, no viral exposés. Instead, her story arrived quietly, like a gentle wind rustling through the prairie. But anyone who read it closely knew something significant had shifted, because for the first time, someone from the cast of Little House on the Prairie had broken the unspoken rule. The curtain was pulled back, the silence had ended, and that silence wasn't hers alone. In the weeks and months following her memoir's release, other voices began to speak. Some were fellow cast members, some were crew who had worked the cameras, held the boom mics, or sat through long hours of taping day after day. And while not everyone echoed Karen's exact experience, one thing became clear. The set of Little House was not the idyllic family haven that fans imagined it to be. The myth of Michael Landon as the perfect father figure began to crack. Some former crew recalled his demanding presence. Others remembered moments of kindness, yes, but also mood swings, power plays, and a very clear hierarchy on set. Michael was the king, and everyone else was expected to fall in line. Melissa Gilbert, who had always spoken of Landon with a mixture of affection and complexity, quietly confirmed what many suspected. While she adored him, she acknowledged he could be emotionally manipulative, especially when his control was questioned. Others shared similar sentiments. It wasn't always overt cruelty. Sometimes it was exclusion, a joke that went too far, a creative decision that felt like a warning, a sudden shift in tone when someone asked for more than they were given. And it wasn't just the women. Several men who worked on the show later admitted they had seen the dynamic play out, but hadn't known what to do. Michael Landon was beloved, respected, and powerful. Speaking out against him, even privately, felt like heresy. The set may have looked wholesome, but behind the scenes, many simply did their jobs and kept their heads down. For Karen, the most startling response came from fans. Many had grown up watching the show. To them, Michael Landon was not just an actor. He was Pa. He was the loving father, the voice of wisdom, the rock in every storm. So when Karen shared her story, there was shock. Some fans felt betrayed, not by her, but by the image they had held onto for decades. They began to rewatch old episodes, looking for clues. Had there always been tension? Had Karen seemed withdrawn in certain seasons? Did Charles and Caroline feel less like partners and more like performers locked into roles? Suddenly, the nostalgia had an edge to it, a weight, a question. But what happened next surprised even Karen. Instead of backlash, she received support. Letters poured in, emails, messages on social media. Some from fans who had never missed a single episode. Others from women in the industry, actresses, writers, directors, who said, "I know exactly what that feels like." The words were different, but the stories were the same. Silenced, overlooked, undervalued, and always expected to smile. Karen's courage had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Still, not everyone responded with warmth. Some accused her of trying to tarnish Landon's legacy, of waiting until he was gone and couldn't defend himself, of bitterness, of jealousy. But those voices were fewer than she expected, and far less certain than they used to be. Because times had changed. The world was finally listening to the voices that had stayed quiet for far too long. And Karen never once said that Michael Landon was a monster. In fact, she was careful to describe him as deeply talented, charming, and in many ways, irreplaceable. He created a show that touched millions. He built characters and stories that still live in the hearts of families around the world. But he was also flawed. He held power and didn't always use it kindly. He hurt people, sometimes without realizing it, and other times with full awareness. Karen's point wasn't to destroy his memory. It was to complete it. Because for too long, the story of Little House on the Prairie had only been told one way. A perfect cast, a perfect set, a perfect man at the center. But real life isn't like that. Real life is messy, complicated, and sometimes even those who give us beautiful things cause invisible harm behind the scenes. The release of Karen's memoir marked something more than a moment of reflection. It marked a shift in how we remember icons. It reminded fans that it's possible to honor someone's work while also holding them accountable. That greatness and cruelty can live in the same person. That you can mourn someone and still acknowledge the pain they caused. And for Karen, that complexity was the whole point. She wasn't asking people to stop watching Little House. She wasn't trying to rewrite television history. She was just asking for space. Space for her story, her truth, her voice, which had been sidelined for decades. She stood up, not in anger, but in clarity. Not to cancel, but to complete the picture. And in doing so, she gave other women, in and out of Hollywood, permission to do the same. But just when the dust seemed to settle, and the world thought it had heard the full story, another surprise surfaced. Because there was one more chapter to this tale, one more moment that even Karen hadn't expected to share. And it would leave fans not with outrage or sorrow, but something even more powerful. Hope. A hope that blossomed amid shadows. Karen Grassle had finally told her truth, but the final chapter of her story held one more twist, something that even her closest friends never saw coming. Just when she thought she had laid everything bare, an old friend from the set reached out. It was not a producer or another cast member, but someone from the crew, someone who had worked behind the scenes during those early seasons when the tension between her and Michael Landon was quietly boiling beneath the surface. What he said stunned her. He told her he remembered the way she had been treated. He remembered the jokes, the sudden changes in scripts, the emotional manipulation. But more than that, he revealed something Karen had never known. There had been conversations, private, closed-door meetings, about replacing her. Not because she was failing at the role, but because she was asking for too much money. Too much respect, too much equality. She felt her heart drop. All these years, she had carried the shame of feeling small, of being humiliated, thinking she had somehow overreacted or imagined it. But now, here was someone confirming that she had been targeted. They had tried to make her question her worth, to erode her presence without ever saying it aloud. This wasn't just about one man. It was an entire unspoken system that had chosen to protect the powerful and dismiss the voices that dared to speak. And then came the box. Months after her memoir was published, a package arrived at her home. No note, no return address. Inside it was a stack of old production memos, photocopied and yellowed with time. They outlined notes from writers' rooms, scheduling adjustments, character development meetings, and buried within them was one memo marked Private, Showrunner Only. It discussed shifting focus away from Caroline, creating more solo emotional arcs for Charles, and reducing non-essential maternal scenes. That memo was dated just 2 weeks after Karen had asked for her raise. Her hands trembled as she read it. For years, she had wondered if she was imagining the shift. Now, on paper, it was clear. Her character had been quietly sidelined, not for creative reasons, but because she dared to demand fairness. She showed the documents to her lawyer, who confirmed what she already felt. They were authentic. And though legal action was long past the statute of limitations, emotionally, it was a thunderclap. For once, she had proof that her pain had not been paranoia. Then came a message that shook her to her core. An anonymous email with a subject line, "There's more." The sender claimed to have access to a vault of behind-the-scenes footage, raw dailies from the early seasons, footage that had never aired. Some of it, the message said, included outtakes of Landon making inappropriate remarks to cast and crew. The email warned her. Releasing it would change everything. It would finally dismantle the pristine image that still protected Landon's legacy, but it would also spark chaos. Karen sat with it for weeks. She told no one. She didn't want to be the reason people stopped watching a show that brought families together. And yet, she couldn't unknow what she now knew. She requested to view the footage privately. A few weeks later, in a quiet screening room in Los Angeles, she saw what had been hidden for decades. And it was worse than she feared. Landon joking with male crew members about female cast members' appearances, making graphic jokes right before emotional scenes, mocking Karen's requests for script changes. One clip showed him saying, off camera, "She wants more lines? She's lucky she still has a job." Laughter followed. Karen sat in that room, frozen, as everything she had felt for years was finally validated, not by sympathy, but by tape. But the twist wasn't just the footage, it was who leaked it. Weeks later, she found out the anonymous sender was a former network executive who had retired early, ashamed of what he had allowed to happen on his watch. He had kept copies of sensitive materials, always telling himself he'd destroy them. But when he read Karen's memoir, he realized silence was no longer acceptable. Karen didn't release the footage publicly. She donated it, under seal, to a nonprofit advocating for women's rights in media, with a clause to release it only if the show was ever rebooted or re-aired, without acknowledging its full history. She didn't want to erase the past. She wanted it told honestly. Now, as Karen Grassle enters the final years of her life, her story has become something far more powerful than any script she ever read. It is a story of survival, of endurance, and of the quiet strength it takes to speak when the world has long since moved on. She didn't ask for fame to return. She didn't demand apologies, but she changed the conversation forever. Karen Grassle's decision to finally speak wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming her voice after decades of silence. For years, she endured quietly, fearing the consequences of confronting a beloved figure like Michael Landon. But at 82, She chose truth over comfort and clarity over nostalgia. Her story cracked the carefully preserved image of Little House on the Prairie and pulled back the curtain on what it really cost to be America's Ma. It showed us that behind the warmth and simplicity of frontier life on screen was a woman navigating humiliation, imbalance, and fear, all while holding the show's emotional center together. Her revelations don't erase the legacy of Michael Landon, but they do complete it. They remind us that greatness and cruelty can coexist, and that the cost of silence can span a lifetime. Karen's story sparked more than outrage. It invited reflection, it invited healing, and in doing so, it gave strength to others who had been waiting for permission to tell their truth. She didn't ask for sympathy, she asked to be heard. And now, finally, the world is listening, not just to a character, but to the woman who carried her, quietly and courageously, for far too long. Karen Grassle once played a woman who held her family together through hardship, and now, in her real life, she's done something just as powerful. She held the truth together long enough to set it free. Her story is not just about Michael Landon. It's about what happens when silence becomes strength, when a woman reclaims her past, not to destroy, but to heal. If this story moved you, the next one will shake you even deeper. Because the myths we love are never the full truth, and it's time we finally hear the other side. Watch what comes next.